We've got a number of pre-registered questions here. Look, the gentleman in the middle, I'm Tom
Nicholas. I'm Chairman of Healthy Soils Australia, and I'm a farmer from Queensland. Elephants in the room. The biggest elephant in the room is the one that we're just told we're not discussing, and that's soil. It can answer all the questions you've talked about, all the problems you've talked about, you know, we got future food and water security, we've got something to offset the coal problems that we're going to sell. We're going to sell it. What do we do? China's going to put an import duty on it. What do? We offset it in the soil, and that catalyses farmers to change their management, and that creates better food and water security. So, you know, the answer is the soil to our future problems.
Okay, and so that's the answer. What's your question?
The question is, why aren't we addressing it? Why are we sweeping it under the carpet? Is it because certain sections want to appropriate the carbon away from the farmers, like they did the trees?
Okay, thank you. Who's going to take that one? Yes, Jerry. Would you like to?
I think we can. So I'm not talking about the science of it. I'm speaking about it as a business person, and there was a huge amount of work that has been done globally and nationally looking at how do we actually physically solve this issue that we've got once we recognise we've got the issue. And so I'm not going to talk about economic instruments at this stage, but just the practical reality is that it's going to take a lot of different initiatives, a lot of different technologies to actually crack the problem. And there is no silver bullet. And a lot of people mentioned one particular preferred route, and it's come up in our fora that here's one way that we're going to save the world. Well, I personally, from the work that I've seen, I don't think there is one way. I think it's going to take a lot of different initiatives, doing a lot of different things in a lot of parts of the world at different time frames as we head towards 2050. And I think soil sequestration is part of that, but I don't believe that it will ever be the total solution. And I think if we put all our eggs in one total solution, or one solution, and ignore all the rest, I think we're ignoring a lot of a lot of the work that's been done around the world. Yeah.
Yes, I heard somebody else in another forum say we don't want the silver bullet, we want the silver buckshot. Tim, were you going to add to that?
Just very briefly about soil carbon. It's important to recognise there's three basic elements in soil carbon. One is the living root mass of grasses and so forth. And if you change grazing regimes, so change the way you use livestock on the ground, you can increase that quite substantially and quite rapidly. But that carbon is also vulnerable to things like droughts and fires and weather events and so it can be released back into the atmosphere as quickly. Or by...
No, just a moment. Just
sorry, if you could just... Would you let me
well, hold on a sec. First of all, just listen to what he's got to say. Listen to what he's got to say, and I'll give you a chance then, just very briefly, to respond.
Right, so that's the one element. The second element is humus, which is the stuff that makes the soil black, and that's somewhat more resistant. That's formed from a breakdown of all of the living stuff in the soil. And thirdly, there's charcoal. And Australian soils, because of Aboriginal burning histories, are very rich in charcoal. And charcoal is quite resilient in the soil. It lasts for a very long time. And there are initiatives worldwide looking at trying to store charcoal in soil as a more permanent solution. And they're promising, but we're not yet, it's a very immature technology. We're not yet at the point where we can apply it broad scale, at a scale at least sufficiently to deal with the problem. And we may well do that in years to come. So I suppose that the take-home message for me with soil carbon is, yes, it's important we address it, potentially a very important technology, but we have to be aware of the complexity of it and the volatility of some of the carbon and the need for more research and development in other areas.
There are hundreds, probably thousands of farmers out there sequestering humus deep in their soil. Now, we don't need more science. We need the incentive for these other farmers to change because they are on a treadmill designed by the input suppliers there to keep their production up under a very, very poor farming system that depletes the carbon. Okay, our whole existence is based on carbon.
Okay, we've got the crux of your point there. I'll just get a quick response now from perhaps somebody else on the panel?
Yeah, I just want to, the science supports exactly the point that Jerry Houston made, that there are many good reasons for improving tillage and farming practices. You're absolutely right about that. And there is a role for storing more carbon. In fact, we've lost carbon from soils over the post-industrial era, and it's good to get them back in. And it is part of the solution, but not the solution. It's part of the silver buckshot, an important part. But by far the biggest issue is the more than 80% of emissions that don't come from trees or soils, but in fact come from fossil fuels. We've got to get that under control as a main central plank of our policy.
Okay, we're running tight here, but look, would you like to put a question?
I'm Tony Hazara. I go to Lake Ginninderra. I've got 2 questions. We were talking about the bleaching of the corals, talking about all the extinction in the world now, but through evolution they change, and because we're putting CO2 in the atmosphere quicker than what it usually is, humans aren't going to survive either. Do we have that point out to everyone? And we've got the carbon tax on the production of carbon. Are we putting a, like, what do I call it? Like a reward on reducing it? Like we need...
Well, we're still waiting for the details of what the government's carbon tax proposal will involve, so we may not be able to answer that just yet, but we can certainly answer the first part of your question. I'll just let the Commission answer there. Thanks.
Let me just address the sort of how quickly can we evolve issue. As you say, you're absolutely right. The climate is changing far faster than it ever has in the past, probably several orders of magnitude faster, and for most species it is simply too fast to keep up in an evolutionary sense. There are some organisms, microorganisms, fruit flies, a few small things that evolve very, very quickly, and we know that their genetics is already changing in response to the warming and climatic change we've had so far. So there will be a few organisms that can keep up, most won't. And as you say, we will be unleashing a new wave of species extinction, the like of which we probably have never seen.
We had a number of pre-registered questions here on this particular area. One of them was from Adam Bant, who I think is here. Adam, do you remember your question? Well, Edward, do you want me to remind you? You very kindly pre-registered it, which was, and I thought we should include some of the pre-registered questions. Your question said this: what would be the to the panel, to the commissioners, what would be the implications for Australian food production and the Murray-Darling sea level rises, Australian tourism with specific reference to North Queensland and the Great Barrier Reef and Kakadu if warming to 2100 were to approach 4 degrees? Well, now we've sort of covered some of that area, haven't we? It was a very good question, wasn't it? Does it sound good hearing it back?
Peter, can I just say something about the agricultural sector, because we haven't actually said much about that yet. Farmers' livelihoods are totally climate dependent. You know, farming as a sector in the human society is absolutely at the front line of climate change. Any impact on reduction in water availability, for example, as we are seeing already in the Murray-Darling Basin and elsewhere, will have an enormous impact on farming. Heat stress on livestock, increases in pests and diseases on livestock will also have an impact. And what a lot of people don't realise is that as you grow things at high CO2, they do grow faster. CO2 acts like a fertiliser, but many species become less nutritious. They have less nitrogen in them, less protein, and the yields of important parts of crops actually reduce even though the plants get bigger. So the impacts on the agricultural sector will be enormous, and farmers are at the front line. Okay,
thank you, Leslie. We can't see up the back very clearly because we've got the lights in our eyes, but Malcolm Turnbull has joined us, and I'd like to give him an opportunity to ask a question.
Well, thanks, Peter. I've actually been here for a while, but I'm a very low-key kind of guy, so I was just down the break.
We hadn't noticed.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I'd like the panel... I'm glad we're talking about agriculture and food security and soil carbon, and I wanted the panel to comment on this issue, which is water scarcity exacerbated by climate change in other countries, and in particular in China and northern India. As we know the agriculture in the food basket of China in the north, and of course in northern India and Pakistan, is overwhelmingly from irrigation. And much of that is, particularly in China, is from pumping groundwater, which, as Rick Evans, the great Victorian hydrologist, has demonstrated from his work in China, that groundwater is being exhausted. It's been unsustainably extracted, and of course stream flows are now being affected by climate change and reduction in runoff from the Himalayas. What impacts do you think continued global warming will have on water and food availability in those countries, I think representing about 40% of the world's population, and what do you think the impact of that is going to be in terms of Australia and in terms of demand for our food exports and, global balances generally?
Thank you. Yes, Roger, are you going to lead with that one?
I happen to sit on a group that advises Premier Wenji Bao. Alexander Downer actually nominated me to it. It's his International Advisory Committee on Environment and Development. The Chinese chap who sits next door to me is their chief meteorologist and climate science advisor. And he said to me on a number of occasions, your country and my country are experiencing the same extension of the subtropical ridges, the same drying of our great food bowls. This is a huge problem for both of us. The Chinese get the science. There's no debate about this. They see it as a really major problem. They know that their food bowls are at risk, but also the areas where they produce much of their coal. That's why they're serious about tackling climate and are tackling it. What will it do to demand for our product? It'll certainly boost it, but we're going to be facing similar sorts of supply restrictions on grain production in particular in the time ahead. It really says that both of us, all of us globally, have got to look for more resilient cultivars, but it also warns the world, I think, that we are heading towards back to a time that you and I both probably thought we'd passed, of a very hungry world and people competing for food resources. And the only way of tackling this in the long run, we can do what we can to adapt, but the only way we can tackle it is to actually get on top of the climate emissions themselves, the greenhouse emissions that are causing the problem fundamentally.
Okay, look, thank you. I'm afraid we have to move on from this issue of the various impacts of climate change, what is happening now and what is likely to happen if we do nothing, to probably the most important section: what kind of action do we need to take? Now, various political solutions have been suggested. We won't be discussing the politics of it, but there are certain obvious things that need to be done that the Commission has looked at, and I'm going to ask both Roger and Jerry, who were specifically interested in this area, to brief you on what they found and what their conclusions were.
Look, there are two great myths that are around that we've found as we've been out on our tour, and you hear all the time in the press. One of them is that we are being asked to act ahead of the rest of the world, that we're being asked to lead the world. Well, frankly, we're not. Even if we do our 5% reduction, we're at the best in the middle of the pack, maybe not quite that. The second great myth is that we don't matter. We're only tiny in this business. Now, the fact is that our emissions, 1.4, 1.5%, are the same as those of Italy, of France, roughly equivalent to the United Kingdom, about the same as those of Indonesia. Now, we're part of the G20. We're probably an even more part of the important part of the top 20 greenhouse emitters. Everybody expects us to pull our weight in the G20, and we're very influential in the G20. There's no reason why we shouldn't have the same expectation placed on us in climate. Now, I was a very unsuccessful climate negotiator for many years, although we did manage to bring in the Kyoto Protocol. But perhaps the most skilled person in Australia and the most experienced as a multilateral negotiator is Howard Bamsey, who only recently retired from a very extensive diplomatic career. Now, Howard's keeping in touch with the game much more closely than I am, and I wonder whether we might be interested in just a few minutes from Howard.
Thanks, Roger. I think the international story on climate change is a story of momentum. It's very gradual. It's not fast enough yet, but it is nevertheless gathering pace. Even within the UN, where you and I spent too long negotiating, even within the UN, despite the setbacks and the failures, there is progress. There has been progress over a short period, the last couple of years, and there's been progress that's really clear over a longer period. The setbacks and failures will continue, but so will progress. And by the way, Roger, to take up your point about Australia's role, inside the UN, we really matter. Australia really matters. We chair one of the key negotiating groups. We have brought a thoughtful and creative approach, and we're relied upon as one of those countries that produces ideas that when we confront brick walls, we can, with some ingenuity, often find ways around them. So we matter, and we matter to continued progress. But the UN won't move quickly enough under its own steam, just under its own steam, to fix the problem. And what's likely, I think, to catalyse much more rapid action there in the next few years will be the sort of action, Roger, you were talking about in other countries. We know that all of the members of the European Union have been taking very strong domestic action for a long time. So there's no question about Australia leading. The EU has been at it for years. But closer to home, our trading partners and our neighbours are beginning to act. And they're beginning to act for the sorts of reasons Malcolm Turnbull referred to just a moment ago. They're seeing the impacts of climate change. They well understand the science. They're understanding the impacts in their own countries, and they're understanding the imperatives, the economic imperatives to move. So we're seeing strong action by China. We're seeing strong action by India and other countries. We're seeing those countries piloting, experimenting with the sorts of economic measures that we're debating here, that we're still debating here. They're getting on with it. So those countries are embarked on a process of responding to climate change, just as we're beginning now to do here. That individual action, the action by individual countries in our region, is going to be very important in catalysing much more action in the UN itself. These two things are going to work together in the next few years in ways in which they haven't in the past, because the action on the ground in individual countries is now much more evident than it was. In the short-term future, I'd like to see more Australian engagement in helping to coordinate action amongst those individual countries, including Australia. If we help in that way, if we bring some of that creativity that we brought to the UN, then we can look for complementarities that will reduce our costs, that will make action, early action, more feasible and easier to do. So there's a great story for Australia still to be found in this gathering momentum internationally.
Thanks, Howard. Jerry, your background has been in business and industry, and I'm really interested in, what you found in trying to plumb the reactions of people in the community, but in particular the sector that you're especially interested in.
Yeah, I think. Well, I've retired, so I think I've got a wider interest than just the oil industry. But I think one of the things that, from my experience, that business does want and does need, I think, to make the sort of investments we need to make the changes that are necessary, is continuity of policy. We've seen some of the sort of the flip flops, in the solar business, and BP was in the solar business. You didn't know whether to scale up, scale down, or what to do, because we didn't have any continuity of policy. And I think for the really big investment decisions, which basically means reboring our power generation over the next 50 years, we're going to need long-term, reasonable policy continuity to make that happen. And I know when I was with the BCA, we did use the word bipartisan as part of our submission, that these are the things we were looking for. So that is an important part. I think just backing that up, when we go around, a lot of people, I think, are wishfully thinking that there is a single solution, there is a short-term thing, we can do something today that costs us nothing to make a difference in the future. The reality is that it's going to be a multi-pronged approach. We believe that there's, fundamentally need a carbon price to send the signals, but that's not going to be the only thing we need. We're going to need ways to bring new technology forward that have been unproven in the marketplace, and that needs support from government and society. And there'll be a lot of other measures. And the gentleman up here talking about carbon sequestration in the soil. If there are things that don't happen because of a carbon price, then that needs a policy setting also to make that happen. But we are talking about a major change over 50 years, and investment decisions going in steps and leading us ultimately to a far lower carbon future. And there isn't a quick solution. There isn't a silver bullet. We can't just turn off the oil supply or the coal supply overnight and then turn around and afford the changes that we need. So it's going to be a long haul. What economically, the message that I'm hearing loud and clear from economists, and certainly our experience in my time in BP, is that if you put off a decision, then it generally gets more expensive later on. So the sooner we start, the less sort of discontinuity we're going to get as we move forward. If we just wait and wait and wait, then I think the shock is going to be huge. It's like akin to a business ignoring the fact that the marketplace has changed almost until it's too late, and then you can't make the change. It's too dramatic and you can't do it. Whereas if you start soon enough, you can actually evolve your business over time to actually be something that is well placed to be competitive at that time.
Yeah, okay. Chris Oughton, I'd like to, from the Kwinana Industries Council, we heard from you briefly before. I'd like to get a quick reaction from you shortly. But I understand that Andy Gillespie from the AWU was going to be here as a guest of one of the MPs today. Does Andy make it? No. Well, Chris, let's... sorry. The South Coast Labor Council. Oh, okay, yep. Give us a quick reaction, please.
Thanks for that. Arthur Rorris from the South Coast Labor Council. I'm its secretary. That's the trade union body in the Illawarra, covering 50,000 workers and others, steel, coal, heavy industry, logistics and the related areas. My initial reaction to this is I'm quite amazed that we have a discourse in this country that says that we're going to do anything by being last, that we're afraid to lead, and no one in our region is saying that. There are some legitimate concerns about our current industries, but I'm not hearing locally anyone denying the existence of climate change or the science or not acting. In fact, I'd go a step further. In our region, the union movement is actually supportive of a programmatic approach to this, a systematic way of actually transforming our industries to address these challenges. We need the certainty and support in government policy to do this, but we are firm believers that to do less or nothing would be the worst possible option. And we know this from history. It happened to us in the 80s with industrial downturns and other things. The way forward is not to run away from your threats, it's to face them head on and to actually organise your economy and your society to adapt to those changes. That's our approach.
Okay.
And we'd like to see that. One more thing, if I may. People are focused on the jobs of the steelworkers and miners, and we don't apologise for wanting to get the best deal for them. But something worries us even more, and that is the jobs for the sons and daughters of the steelworkers and miners that we may lose if we don't act soon.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Chris Oughton, can we get the microphone down to Chris? Yes. Just tell us, I know you made it quite clear at the beginning you're interested in solutions, and first of all, I'd like to hear your reaction to what you've heard so far from the commissioners and whether you're going to add anything. And whether you take some heart from what we've heard about the attitude in the Illawarra.
Thanks, Peter. I do, actually. Kwinana Industrial Area employs 5,000 people directly and 26,000 indirectly and contributes about 16 billion to the state economy of Western Australia, and that's 2005 figures. So it's not insignificant. The industrial area is internationally regarded as world's best practice for synergies, transactions between companies that use waste products and so forth. Now, that says that industries in Kwinana have been innovating in this area for many years, and the facts show that to be the case. So we take climate change seriously, accept that it's happening and need to do something about it, and we are. What we do need, exactly as what Jerry said, is to stop this political flip-flopping around the place, because all that does is create uncertainty. And business, in order to innovate, needs to have an environment of certainty. Without that certainty, the pointy heads in the back room say, no, we're not going to invest here in this country, we're going to put our money into a different country. So we need certainty.
First of all, it's certainty that you want, and even if you don't particularly like what political solution might emerge, at least you've got something to work with and a decision-framing network.
Yeah, that's correct. Like, for example, with a carbon tax, all of a sudden you wake up in the morning and read about it in the paper that that's what's being proposed. That's not the way industry needs to deal with this issue. We need to know what is a bipartisan approach planned now well into the future so that those companies can make those investment decisions, which take sometimes years to get approved.
Yes.
That's what we need.
Okay, thank you, Chris. A couple of questions from the floor. Yes, would you like to take the microphone?
I'm Monty Maguire from Canberra College. This is a two-part question about money. I just wanted to know how the funding compares between, like, say, providing more efficient and economical fossil fuels and natural gases, and how that compares to the funding provided for more efficient solar power or green energy solutions.
Okay, can we answer that question first?
Yeah, sure.
Is that yours, Jerry, or...?
I'm not entirely sure what the question is, but
how do they compare? Like the amount of money that's being presented.
Yeah, I really don't know on a global basis. All I can say is that both are very important. I think, given the comment I made before that we're going to have, fossil fuels around for quite some time, it's absolutely paramount that we drive, the emissions from those down, and there's some fairly clear pathways in which you can do that. But at the same time, building our muscle on things like solar is absolutely fundamental, because in 100 years' time, solar's going to be a very, very significant reality, and we'll need it. So I don't think I don't think it's that useful to sort of differentiate. I do know that there's a tremendous amount of effort going into both of them on a global basis, huge amount of effort, and into things like the massive investment there is on second-generation biofuels, which is effectively you end up with a liquid fuel that's got zero carbon in the total cycle. So there's a lot of work going on.
So there are large sums of money going into either.
Huge sums of money. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. We've got a question down on the front row. If we could get the microphone down, please.
My name is Declan Clausen. I'm from the University of Newcastle. I'm a first-year environmental engineering student, and I'm from the Charlton electorate. My question is in regard the multiple options that are available to deal with climate change, and I'm just wondering, there's uncertainty in all these options, and it's a bit of a gamble with some of them, I suppose, as to how effective they would be. If there's a single most effective option that we could be taking today, what would that be? I know that things like geosequestration are somewhat uncertain. I'm just wondering, is there a certain option that we can take?
Look, can I answer that by, again, going back to the silver buckshot analogy? There's not a single option. The single most important thing we can do is to think about pricing. That's relative pricing of polluting and non-polluting sources. Size doesn't matter, but pricing does matter. Ask any farmer who's deciding what crops to plant. Ask any businessman who's making investments. Ask any supermarket manager. Ask anybody buying products. Price works up and down, and it incentivises actions right across the board. Now, there are many different ways of delivering a relative price, but getting a sustainable framework that people will have confidence will continue on into the future is going to be the one most critical thing that we can do, rather than playing games around picking particular technologies or particular initiatives. I think both our major parties recognise that in their own way. Both of them are committed to the 5% target. If Australia is not being asked to lead the world, but if it is, it's being asked by both our major parties to do exactly that. So pricing is critical. Achieving our 5% reduction at minimum is critical. Going into the next decade on a downward trajectory is critical, and that depends on business confidence that the framework will be continued.
Okay, thank you, Roger.
Hi, look, I'm Christine Trull. I'm a teacher at Gungahlin College, and we've just started a sustainability group there, a brand new college this year. Look, my question is can you give us some best practice examples that are happening across the world in terms of reducing carbon emissions that Australia can look to for kind of inspiration or ideas? In your opinion.
Yes. Is that for you, Tim, or one of the other commissioners?
Look, I can try very briefly to give you a sense of it. In a place like Canada, where I've been recently, you look at what's happening across the different provinces. There's a whole series of approaches. So in British Columbia, for example, a carbon tax has been instituted that's driving change, particularly in the transport sector. It's currently at $20 a tonne. It'll soon be at $30 a tonne. If you go to Ontario, further to the east, they are phasing out all of their coal-fired electricity generation in the next 4 years. It was originally 40%. They're going to bring it back to zero and replace it with new nuclear capacity, which is their solution. Further east again in Quebec, there's a completely comprehensive program of energy efficiency and switching to clean renewable fuels, hydro and so forth. And altogether, those very diverse programs, although there's no strong federal lead in Canada, are adding up to a situation where the Canadian government looks set to achieve its emissions reduction target under the Copenhagen Accord, which is a minus 17% lead. In the US, we're seeing a similar sort of thing. They're also, they've pledged a 17% emissions reduction for all of the rubbish that goes on in Congress and so forth. They're already at minus 9%, and they've got a series of programs across the country coming from new standards for their motor vehicles and so forth, through to an emissions trading scheme that's going to be opening towards the end of the year in California that will add to that. So there's tremendous diversity of things happening all around the world, even within one single country. It's hard for me to pick any of those as ideal, but you can get a sense from what's happening that there's a great breadth of approaches which are all working to this common goal.
Okay, well look, I think we have to move on from this particular segment to in a sense, the finale to all this. And but there is one issue that I think we need to hear about and to discuss, because roughly 20 million Australians get their information about all this through the media in one form or another. And I know Susanna Elliott is particularly interested in communication, and you've been especially interested in the way these issues have been communicated to people through the media, haven't you? Tell us about what you found, Susanna.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that there's a lot of noise out there. I often get this feeling, it's a bit like being in one of these kids' ballrooms, you know, in an indoor playground. And there's lots of coloured balls flying all over the place, and they're flying out. Sometimes they hit you in the face, and that's what it feels like. So when you're watching the debate being played out in the media, it often feels very chaotic. And you know, there's lots of reasons for that, and obviously we can't go into all of those here today, because clearly that's actually a whole study in itself. But I think there's a couple of points that's worth thinking about. One is that we need to face the fact that the media is not just about education, it's about entertainment. Newspapers need to sell their papers. Television stations need an audience, and if they don't have that, then they die. and that's a fact. So we have to be realistic about what the media can do, and it's not just about here are the facts. The other thing, of course, is that arguments are interesting. If everybody agreed, it wouldn't make very interesting television or interesting newspaper coverage. So that's another fact that we have to bear in mind. But what that does mean is that what you see being played out in the media doesn't always reflect what's actually going on, for example, within the scientific community. Now, from our perspective at the Science Media Centre, and we're dealing with scientists every day, we're dealing with the media every day, what we see really are two different issues here. One is the science, and of course there has been some debate about the science which is not reflecting the scientific community, and I think we all need to be aware of that. And my sense is that we are moving on, that the media has had some difficulty in covering science. I mean, climate science is very complicated. You need a lot of different experts, and there also are a lot of people out there talking about climate science who actually don't know what they're talking about, and that makes it very confusing. However, my sense is that the media is actually adapting to climate change, if you like. They are actually able to see that there is this issue of balance, that you can't give 50% of your time to a very, very small group of people when thousands of scientists are saying one thing. You can't give equal weighting to the opposing view. And I think most of the media now understands this issue. So I do believe that we're moving on. However, there is another part of this, and that is the debate that we're having about what we do about this. So we understand that the science is settled. Now there needs to be a debate about what we do, and I don't think that we should be put off by the noise. It is chaotic, that's understandable. There's a lot of voices that need to be heard. There's a lot of people that have livelihoods at stake. We all need to be involved in this discussion, and therefore we should not be depressed or put off by the noise of this debate. It's necessary. We need to talk about it. We need to debate, and we need to discuss. But these are two different things. One is the science, and we must trust the scientists, and we must move on from that and say, okay, now here's the real debate. This is what we really need to talk about. There's just one other thing I wanted to say, and that is that a lot of this also comes back to people, motivating people. And it's not just a question of the media. We need to find ways of accessing community spirit, of getting past the gloom and doom message, which people tend to cut off from. I mean, after a while, you just can't take that kind of depressing message all the time. We need to move into action mode. And I think there's just so many people in this room who actually have expertise in this area about how we motivate communities. It's not just about the media, it's about working together, it's about finding that fighting spirit. I mean, people often talk about wars, you know, and how we actually come together and how we work together in a war situation. And in a way, I think we need to tap into that spirit of, okay, let's not just talk about his opinion, her opinion, and how they're different. Let's talk about what we can agree on. Get round a table, talk about it, not just opinions in the media, but let's actually talk and get into this spirit of action. And I'd just like to hear from the people in the audience, because I think there's a lot of expertise out there.
Yes, we've got a couple of minutes here, but I know we've got a number of representatives of advocacy groups who obviously spent a lot of time and energy trying to communicate a message. Have we got somebody who'd like to either put a question to the audience or have something to say? Yes, please go ahead.
I'm not an advocate of a particular sort of means of dealing with this issue, but I'm kind of surprised by the fact that everyone's talking about how we've accepted the science, because you wouldn't know that if you read the policies of the major political parties in this country. There is an alarming dissonance between the prognosis that is in this report and the 5% 2020 reduction targets that are talked about by the Labor and the Liberal parties. And I don't understand how any of the members of those political parties can sit in this room with straight faces when they know that their policies are utterly devoid of credibility.
Have you got any ideas about how we might, as a country, as a nation, how we might go about better communicating to people what are essentially fairly complex arguments when the role of the media, the mainstream media, is basically to communicate through headlines and 30-second grabs.
Well, I mean, I would have thought that this would be an excellent space in which to do that. The Climate Commission is an awesome idea, and I think it was a great initiative of the Labor government. But Nick Minchin came out yesterday saying that it's all denialist propaganda, and I don't quite understand, or I can't envision a way in which we can sort of take things forward when major political figures are putting this stuff out there as though they have any authority on this issue. So
Okay,
I'm
thank
confused.
you. Yes, Tim, do you want to...
Just respond very briefly. I think we should acknowledge the fact that both political parties have endorsed the climate report, the science report that we've produced, and that's important to understand, I think, that that's the case. Look, and I just wanted to make a comment about the media. I mean, the extent of the problem is pretty vast. A friend of mine went to debate a supposed authority on the climate issue, had a sceptical viewpoint recently, and this fellow was promoted by the television station as being very credible. When we went back and had a look at what he'd actually done, we found that he had written a book. One book was called Palmistry. It was about reading your cat's paw to learn about the future. And somehow this person had been put up as a credible authority on the climate area, and no one in the media had bothered to check. So it is that sort of stuff is really problematic. It's very difficult. I think that there is an obligation really on the media to try to lift the game
and makes
a
a
bit.
difficult job even more difficult.
Yeah,
Yes.
indeed.
Yes. Bishop George Browning of the Anglican Diocese of Canberra and Goulburn, active and prominent in a number of community roles, national and local. Could we just get a quick comment from you?
I'm sorry that many of the politicians are not here for this segment. Human behavioural patterns are very hard to change. We all like doing what we've always done. And any presentation in the media which suggests that being asked to change is unreasonable will go down well. And in the community at the moment, that position is being put, that the request or the suggestion that we should change is unreasonable. One of the problems that science faces, sorry guys, is that human behaviour is not changed by facts and figures, by data, by information. That doesn't change human behaviour. And what does change human behaviour is a narrative that actually gets into the heart and the mind of the people. And at the moment, it's actually not a debate science against science, facts against facts. It's actually a debate of science against narrative. And because these so-called climate skeptics actually don't have a science argument, there is no argument, we've heard that today, and in its place you have narrative. And the narrative is fairly predictable. It is that to change is unreasonable, it's going to cost you, it'll cost your pocket, cost your mortgage. The word tax is part of a narrative. And I regret deeply that both sides of politics have accepted the word tax, because tax sounds like an imposition. It sounds like something unreasonable, something which you shouldn't have to pay but is being forced on you. And I think it was a great mistake for that language to be used in the narrative. So what is required is for everybody in the community to contribute to a narrative which actually indicates the positive. That I actually think that a post-carbon dependent economy will be a great world in which to live. It's being painted the opposite. I think there will be great opportunity, a great sense of community. At the moment, self-interest prevails. And as Roger said, one of the things which dictates human behaviour is I will if next door has, but if next door hasn't, then I'm not going to. And that's not simply a personal thing, it's a community thing, and it's an international thing, so that the argument in Australia is that we won't because they haven't. But as we've already heard, per head of population, Australia's community, myself, I emit more carbon than almost any other living person on the face of the planet as an Australian. So that the responsibility to act is very considerable. If I was invited in the first place, why am I here today? I'm here, first of all, on behalf of my grandchildren. I go through enormous agony that my grandchildren will say to me, Grandpa, you actually made choices for yourself that have actually reduced our choices in the future. And that is a huge moral argument to me. But I'm also here on behalf of my sister who lives in the Horn of Africa, who, as we've already heard, some of the people who die in Africa die because of the choices I make here in Australia. And this is part of the narrative that we ought to convey. And the reality is that thousands of jobs will not go overseas. The reality is we will all survive, that Australia will still be one of the most prosperous and most sought-after countries of the world. But if we don't act, then one of the other points that was made, the reason why Britain is so committed to this is they are terrified of the security implications of not acting. All the climate science indicates that Britain will be kind of like an oasis, which is very, very attractive for people to come to. It's in Britain's best interest, our best interest, to actually act in this way. There's no such thing anymore of our interest being different to the global interest. The global interest is my best interest.
Okay, thank you very much, George. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I think we need to use that time for you to be able to ask anything you want of the commissioners while they're here before you go off into private one-to-one sessions. Now, which of those hands am I going to take? Perhaps you could go here. You haven't had a chance to ask a question yet, so just down here, please.
Okay. So this is in regard to some, first I'm George, I'm a Hawker College student, science student, and I'm just asking in regards to what will the funding be like towards climate change science, especially as the problem becomes more pressing and as greater actions taken towards it as we progress. Is this going to affect funding towards the scientific community in fields that maybe aren't so relevant towards this topic in general? Is this, so physics for example perhaps? Because I especially think it's incredibly important that we still maintain our level of, in a sense, we got to keep funding these areas of science because I think they're particularly important, especially myself, perhaps looking for a career, and also the scientists in that field as of now. Yeah, is that going to affect the changing in the funding as we progress?
Yes, is anyone going to address that?
Yeah, I'll have a quick comment on that. I think we're going to see a trend toward more interdisciplinary type research and research that connects science of various types with community and action on the issue. So I still think we'll need the fundamental core disciplines. They're required. But I think I don't suspect we're going to see a big growth in funding for the core areas. I think we're going to see a growth in funding for interdisciplinary research because of the nature of the complexity of the problems, research on resilience, research on adaptation, and so on. So I think it's going to open up some really exciting areas of research, and we already start to see these trends in the universities and CSIRO and so on.
Okay. Yes, Ian, you've had a question, so I'll just give some of the others a chance, and we'll come to you if we get it. Yes, young lady there. Just take the mic.
Hiya, I'm Ellie Williams and I'm here on behalf of Dixon College. The question, or what I'm here for really, is to understand what lengths do we and are we willing to go to reduce our emissions? Whether we have to lead the world or sit back and wait for someone else to come ahead of us in reducing our emissions shouldn't really matter. It should just be making it happen overall. By looking at solar energy, wind farms, farming and trade, housing and industry, how we're building our houses to make them more economical and sustainable, and all the other solutions. What I'm asking is what lengths are we going to and what is being done? Forget about the costs, forget about the fact that whatever we do, carbon, is going to be created. It's what is actually happening now to make sure...
What is actually happening now?
Yeah.
Okay, yes. Who's going to address that one?
Well, I think the reason that countries are acting all over the world, and we're not being asked to lead the world, we're being asked to keep up, and that's a critical point to make. The reason that countries around the world are acting are both because of their understanding of the science and because people like you are saying, let's get on with it. We can't rely on a top-down global agreement. We will build the confidence for that global agreement by each country acting and by each citizen within each country really saying the sorts of things that you're saying and getting on and doing it.
Okay, next question is from... is it a question or a speech? You just have the look of somebody who's about to make a speech.
When are we really going to come back down to reality? As an Indigenous person, 200 years ago, another culture has come to this country and changed the whole infrastructure, landscape, waterways, everything. Now, I've been living in a place and a space where I've been telling the truth to people. I've been reading history. I've been telling the story of Aboriginal Australia. This hurts me to sit here and listen about business all the time, because business took our land away. My adoptive father helped build one of the Kwinana pipes, ready mix, pipeline standing up, in the 70s. In the 70s, I read a book called Science Facts. 70 years or 40 years of facts of what we're talking about now has gone. We've lost it because corporations, unfortunately, have bestowed something that you can't take away. West Australia had timber industries. We haven't got very much left.
So I just want to abbreviate you a little bit because we're running very short of time. Can I just ask you...
Where in the reality is Australia really going? We have to be careful of what we're doing. I can't stand here and not tell the truth. We have to all change our lifestyles, because if we don't, we're all going to end up in a tent. We're all not going to have water. We're all going to be pretty messed up. And with all of that, a lot of health problems, as it is. Now, we've got a lot of water around the world, so it's all going to happen. I'm an observer of life. I don't live in this lifestyle. And you all think, unfortunately, it's not rude, but it's my observations. Everyone's come to country, rorted our lands, built on the urbanisations of our coastlands, taken our foods and beautiful lands away. And you all go to another country to try and get that. You go to Bali to get that. You go to other places to get that. Well, our land's worth saving and being looked after and not being compromised by business that's just going to keep chop, 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 dig, dig, dig all the time. I've been doing this talk for 2 years to children, maybe to one of those classes here today. I can't not say anything. This is our life, Aboriginal life. You're going to go into the country and do another dismal thing? No. And a lot of Indigenous cultures around the world are being compromised. I talked to a Brazilian lady last week, and they're worried. All Indigenous cultures have been compromised by the industries of which everyone has amounted to now. And we shouldn't be there. Okay, our land is to be looked after and cared for, not to be built on or dug under, but to be looked after, as it has been for 40,000 years.
Thank you very much.
200 years.
That's a very powerful message.
It's not going to fix it very quickly.
Thank you very much for that. Very, very powerful message. Thank you. And we've got time for a couple of more responses. Maybe just where the microphone is there. Thanks.
Thank you. My name's Jim Sullivan, just run a private business. I read the report. I think the media are not going to take that. It's just too detailed and too complex. What I did like was when Tim gave some snippets about some of the information about how other countries are actually handling some of their climate change and the topics they're doing. Just little tiny bits. I don't know if the Commission could actually do that on the website or even put out a newsletter, because then we can disseminate that kind of information, which is actually a strong message rather than all the stuff we read in the media.
Anyone got any suggestions on how we actually do something to act on that sort of, very passionate plea we heard there? We took the country, now we're wrecking it. What are we going to do? How are we all going to come together to do something about it?
Hello, I'm Kerry and I'm a retired federal public servant. Noting that this venue is Parliament House and there are the presence of many of our parliamentarians here, I'd just like to highlight that the bottom line seems to me that our society is a democracy. And I just wonder whether in some ways the issues have become so permeated by the politics, whether any of the panel can comment on how we circumvent those sorts of hurdles and get on, as the pleas have gone up today, with doing something constructive.
Yes, we've certainly heard some very passionate pleas, haven't we, from people who just want us all to come together and do something. So, Tim, is this something that you need to address?
Well, I think it is. Look, partly what we need to do is find common ground, and we find that through common understanding. And part of the Commission's job is to go out there and do just what we've done today: listen to people, talk, share information, and start building that common ground. And as we get that, I'm confident it won't happen this year, maybe not even next year, but over time we'll get a much more sophisticated and nuanced and better approach than we've got today.
Okay, could I just, look, our time is up, and as I said, you are going to have an opportunity to have one-to-one conversations with the commissioners over a lunch outside. I'd just like to ask the other commissioners what you're taking away from today before I hand over to Tim to wrap this all up. Susanna, we'll take it in order. Would you like to start? You're the communications...
Yeah, well, I mean, communication is clearly critical. And I think it's been a wonderful forum. I've really enjoyed this today, and I think we have to keep reminding ourselves that there are other ways of communicating, not just through the media, and we should keep these kind of roundtable discussions going. We need to listen to you, we need to talk to you, we need to find out what your concerns are, and we need to talk more about how we move forward. And we need to hear from everyone, every sector of society, that's clear.
Yes. Jerry, what have you taken out of today?
Well, you know, the thing I love about these forums, I learn something new every time, and also I get to experience the passions that this subject raises, because it is so fundamental. But I think the refreshing thing about this time is that, you know, following on from the release of the science report, is that I'm detecting a bit of a move that actually, we can actually put the science to bed, you know, put a pink bow around it, say that's a reality, and what are we going to do about it, and really focus the debate on what are we going to do about it. And I think, and ultimately, if our discussions, you know, help that process, and you know, people talked about the democratic process, you know, the people who live and work in this building represent the views of their constituents. So if we can help move that, then I think we'll get action.
I guess for me, I was really heartened to see many members from both sides of Parliament here today, and we've spoken with members from both sides of the House. So that's a good thing. If I came away from the meetings we've had with politicians and from this meeting with a message, it is that we really have to explain that the world is acting. We can't wait for a global agreement. But if we act now, we are going to actually have a better transition to the future. And finally, I hope that if we keep doing this over time, the debate might shift away from slogans to actually focusing a bit more on how we deliver what we all know we need to do.
Leslie.
As somebody who's been working in that climate change impacts area for a long time, it's really, really easy to get depressed. And I give a lot of talks and people go out of them feeling very depressed. I think what these forums are doing, though, is filling us all with more of a sense of optimism, because I think if we do just stay pessimistic and give up, then we really are stuffed. And so it's really, really important to stay optimistic, tell ourselves and each other that we can do something really positive and move forward. And it's been a very optimistic and positive vibe here today, I think.
Will?
I think it's always interesting from forum to forum that you always get a different take on these issues. And here I think there are two things that stand out. One is we have a much stronger representation of young Australians and people who are worried about the next generation or two, what sort of world they're going to live in. That message came out quite clearly. And then also the message from Indigenous Australia is very important, because it reminds us that climate change is really important, but it doesn't exist in isolation from other issues. And we've got to integrate some of these issues.
Yes, well, Tim, would you like to just wrap up the whole thing? And
Thank you. Yes, thanks. Look, I just begin by thanking you, Peter, for a fantastic job of facilitating this event. And could I also thank our parliamentarians who've come through the session, but particularly thank Tony Windsor, who's the last man standing. I think you've been there through the whole thing, so thank you very much for hearing us out. Could I also just thank all of the eminent Australians and others who've travelled so far to be here today. I know I'm very aware of the time that you've put in to be part of this. And thank all of the students who've thought obviously long and hard about their questions before they've asked them, and all of you citizens of Canberra who've come along for the day too. This is what democracy is all about. This is how we make change. And I think together, I think Leslie's right. We have got it within us to overcome what seems at the surface to be a very, very large problem, almost insurmountable problem. But we are making progress, and I'm confident we'll continue to make progress, particularly through the sort of commonality we forge on days like today. Thank you very much.